May I request Dr. Mark to present the next presentation on accessing regulatory data.
So is that forward?
Dr. Mark is a technical director of Global MSDS.
That's the laser. That's forward. Back.
Dr. Mark.
Yeah. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a regulatory toxicologist. I've been in the chemical industry for 42 years, and I know you're astounded by how youthful I am. But I worked for ICI, DuPont, INEOS, and latterly was the global director for Mitsubishi. 6 years ago, I retired, but subsequently we set up a company to develop safety data sheets using modern technologies, and they provide low-cost, compliant data sheets around the world. But I'm not going to talk to that today. One of the most recent developments that occurred is the way people use the internet to access information. And our company has been working with regulators in Europe and US and around the world to look at regulatory data and how that information is accessible to people with a view to increasing awareness of regulations and to aiding compliance. The first thing to recognize is that there's been a massive explosion in the chemical industry over years. The estimates that have been produced by CEFIC at the global market were that, the global output of chemicals in 1970 was 171 billion dollars. By 2016, it was $3.4 trillion. So that's a massive growth, and they expect running at about 3 to 4% per annum, but by 2030, be around $6.3 trillion. And that massive growth in chemicals has actually caused many problems. People's awareness of chemicals is massively raised, and that's a good thing, but also a bad thing. And people nowadays see chemicals as being not necessarily the most positive thing to have in your environment. If you look at where these chemicals are being produced, the other trend we've seen over the last 10 years particularly was a move to Asia, particularly a massive growth in the Chinese market, a reduction in the proportion of the EU market and the US market. The Indian market never really took off. It was supposed to be forecasted 10 years ago as the biggest market, but it never happened. Part of that reason is because of lack of awareness of regulatory information and needs, and the perception of the Indian market in the world. At the same time we've had this massive growth and explosion in chemicals, there's been a really large growth in chemical regulations. And this is primarily due to, sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button. No. Right. This is due to the growth of governmental laws trying to manage the hazards of these chemicals that are being transferred around the world. In addition, leading corporations have adopted their own programs, WHO, UN, etc. And that's been followed by an increase in complexity and cost in not only of knowing regulations, but complying with regulations. In the last two presentations, you saw a little bit about the increasing cost of REACH, probably the most burdensome regulation ever to have existed. But we're now embarking in a new phase where we have China REACH, K-REACH. Everybody wants a REACH. And they'll all want their own data, they'll all want their own risk assessment. And that leads to an incredibly difficult challenge for chemical companies that are trying to market on a global basis. If you look at that globalization, how has it happened? Well, it actually started off in the World Summit in 2002. And there was a recognition by the developed countries that they needed to do something to manage these chemicals that are being produced and shipped around the world. And what they were looking for is to minimize the human health and environmental impact. And there was a general consensus view that this would be the direction that regulations would go in the future. In the Rio Summit in Brazil in 2012, they reaffirmed that commitment. Bearing in mind, there's not been a lot of development during that period. The regulations were really going very slow. they have developed the global harmonized system. And the idea here was to have one system for the world. And people have heard of global harmonized system thinking this is a single system. However, it's not. The intention was a single system covering all countries. But they allowed for modular implementation. And the reason for this was because many of the existing countries had their own systems, didn't want to change. They didn't want to throw away what they had. What they wanted was adjustments in the globalized system. And that's left to actually adaptations, local adaptations to GHS. So for example, GHS in Asia, CLP in Europe, OSHA GHS in the US, but then also national changes to the implementation. Some implement different parts at different times, and that leads to a massive delay and disharmonization in the regulations. So the question is, how does a chemical company operating in India know what's happening in Malaysia, in Korea, in the US, etc.? Do you have your own expertise in-house? Well, probably not. Do you use the internet? Maybe. But who's going to tell you which is the right information and which is the wrong information? And that's why you often go to consultants. And consultants will have expertise in different parts of regulations, in different regions, and in different countries. So you heard, for example, CIRS saying, well, we will do Asian registrations. Lots of people have been offering European registrations. When TSCA reform has been finally sorted out, if it ever gets sorted out, there'll be a new system in the US, and people will be helping with that as well. One of the problems that many companies have is, how do you actually afford to pay for these people to tell you this? How do you know what you don't know? And I see people nodding, but how many people in here are in a chemical company that has a regulatory department? No one. Yeah? These were the luxuries of the big companies 20 to 30 years ago when I started. Many companies now, unless you're a major international company, does not have a regulatory department. When the EU set out their vision of the world, and this was prior to the implementation of REACH, they wanted by 2020 to have implemented a system which would eliminate chemicals that were carcinogenic, mutagenic, and reproductive toxin or equivalent concern from the market. And you've heard in a number of presentations today, the REACH process is pushing in that direction. They estimate somewhere between about 150 and 350 chemicals will be banned from Europe in the next few years. And this is through this process of registration, but then authorization and sunsetting. Now, REACH's aim has four processes: registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction. It sounds simple. You just get your chemicals, you do your registration, they assess them. This piece of legislation was the largest legislation ever to be produced in the world. It has thousands of pages. It has many tens and hundreds of thousands of pages of guidance that go with it. And they expect companies to understand it. The problem we have now is that this regulation flows into other health and safety and environmental legislation and into national legislation. So not only are you seeing the EU legislation, but you're seeing it in the national levels in their implementation. Brexit, with the British leaving the EU, is just going to add another level of complexity to it. And this just adds and compounds this question of how do you know what's going on? If we look at the development of the REACH-like regulations around the world, and you heard Sears talking about K-REACH, China REACH, everyone wants a REACH, yeah? There are increasing numbers. We've heard China, Korea, but Malaysia, Russia, Taiwan, Turkey, they're all expecting to develop something, but invariably they don't have the resources to do it properly. So these are going to be half-hash systems, incomplete and slightly different requirements. The main elements of these are very similar, though. They require chemical regulations with a notification and registration element, notification of new chemicals, like they were describing in China, registration or not of existing chemicals, like in the REACH process, an inventory-based system combined with a number of elements to do with hazard assessment and risk assessment. And finally, periodic reporting of volumes. And then data requirements. We talked about the increasing cost of data being generated to satisfy this registration. The issue is, again, it's not globally harmonized. It's very different in different countries. An EU registration will not get you registration in China or in Korea. But the overall registration does not apply. It has to be redone in a different way. And the trends going forward are the general perception that chemicals that we've been using for many years are dangerous. And that all the arrangements we've had in the past are not acceptable. In other words, we're being put at risk. And if you ask any consumers, that's what they believe. And part of that is because the chemical industry is not managing chemicals as safely as they could. There is a move also from hazard assessment, that's the intrinsic property of a chemical, like an acid burns, so it's corrosive, to risk assessment, and that is, if I were to handle that acid in a particular way, might it burn me? Yeah? So that's the risk assessment. More and more regulators are looking at sophisticated risk assessment-based regulation, and that is incredibly difficult to manage because it requires information on use. How complex supply chains use chemicals, how they use them, how much they use them, what period they use them over, the frequency, whether they wear gloves, respirators, etc., etc. And that will be a greater cost to industry because ultimately, unless you're registered, you won't be able to sell them. So by now, you're really depressed, yeah? It gets better as we move on now because we're going to tell you some interesting developments which actually start making your life easier. Every time I touch it, it jumps, so bear with me. The first thing is the barriers to understanding legislation is that over 100 countries are to develop regulations. It amazed me when we actually started looking how many. It's about 136 countries in the world have chemical regulations. There are tens of thousands of regulations that have been developed. Many of them have been successively changed over periods of time, but some of them are very, very outdated. They're normally available through government websites, and this has been the growth of the internet over the last 20 years. So, for example, most countries in the world publish their regulations on the government website. So you say, well, there's no reason why you can't find them. The issue, though, is they're often in the local language. They're published in Mandarin, Thai, Cyrillic. Well, I don't read those languages. When I'm searching in Google, they never come up in my searches because, funnily enough, they're not in English. Next, they're sometimes published as an image. They're not a text file. So the search engines can't actually get into them and find the piece of information you're looking for. So even if you searched it in Chinese, you won't find it because it's a picture. Each page is a picture. There are, however, regulatory service providers that give you this service to show you where this information is and to help you interpret it. And there are lots and lots of companies offering that service. It's probably one of the most fast-growing businesses that you perhaps should consider getting into. The problem is they're not inexpensive. Or putting it simply, they're very costly. Often you need to know who to ask and what to ask before you can ask the question. So the question is, how do you know what to ask if you don't know it's there? Very, very difficult. So here we get a chance now to ask the God of chemicals, what do we want in a perfect world? And I've written something that I think would be the perfect world we could look for. First one, global regulations. The same regulation everywhere in the world. That's not going to happen. So forget that one. It's fantasy. Secondly, all countries would have regulations that we understood and could read. That would be nice. So we knew what was happening in Korea. We knew what was happening in the Philippines or wherever. It would cover all sectors, our knowledge. In other words, we know everything about general chemicals, pesticides, agrochemicals, pharma products, etc., etc. We want this information to be very current, up to date, the latest information. It's no need to know about things that were 20 years ago because they no longer exist. You only ever want to go back if you've got a problem. You're trying to work out what you did 20 years ago. But that's not today. But this information would have to be searchable in any language. So you will probably speak Hindi, maybe, English, yes? Do you speak Mandarin? Probably not. I can't. Yeah? Cyrillic, Russian, Bulgarian. It goes on and on and on. Very few people have the language skills and the search engines to be able to search right across them all. And finally, if it was wonderful, it'd be free. You wouldn't have to pay for this. Yeah? Well, very rarely are things free in life. They're usually the rubbish. Yeah? So anyway, we decided to work with the European Chemical Agency, ECHA, through with the US EPA and others, to say, well, could that vision come true? Could you actually provide all this information free, and could you do this? And the answer is yes. It's been done. And it's actually been done at this site up at the top, this secure website here called ChemReg. And I'll leave some cards at the front where you can go away, register, and access the information free. Firstly, we seeded the database with 16,000 regulations, everything up to 2016. And within about 6 weeks, we'll do everything to date. So that is every global regulation in every country in the world. 136 we're actually at now. It covers a very wide range of topics and subtopics, and I'm going to show you some slides which show you the sorts of things you can look for. But the clever thing is that we work with Google. Google's a clever company, really clever company. People have probably used Google Translate. You may even on your iPhone use the Google Translate app, the equivalent menus. We work with them to apply this to regulations, which means you can search in Hindi, in Chinese. You don't have to know Chinese anymore. And when you want to see the document, you can search it and transfer it back into 131 countries, their languages. It's readable in any language on the planet. Yeah? And it's free to everyone. So I'm going to run you through some examples of what it is. And literally, when you leave here, you can go to your smartphone and access it and play with it. The site, as I said, is called ChemReg. We paid for its development, but we intend the chemical industry and the global regulators to maintain it in the future. We will not have to do it because the community will actually be providing the regulations. So gone in the future will be any need to pay service providers to understand where regulations are. It's open access. In other words, anyone can look at it. A regulator, a consumer, our competitors, chemical companies, anyone. It's open to any contributor. So if anybody knows of a regulation, they can send it in and we'll put it up into the website and make it free for everyone in the world. And that's the offer we've been making to ECHA, the European Council, and also to US EPA, WHO, and others. And they're actually considering it. They're thinking from now on, they will provide every new regulation in the world that they develop and push them through. And we're going to go to every country. So we're, for example, we're going through ICC to the Indian government to say, any new regulation, if they give it us, we'll put it up for free. It has this search function, and I'm going to show you a little bit about the search function just in a few slides. Well, firstly, the search function, and this again, this has been developed with Google and their help. You can search in the title, you can search in the content of the regulation, but you can also search, and this is a clever language enabled. And basically what it does, it recognizes the language you type in, it works out who you are and where you are, then it translates it, and then it looks at the PDF and it searches in the language of the PDF for your text that you've looked for. So an example I use is ethanol. If you write ethanol in Mandarin, I can't understand it. And if you search on the internet, you only find Chinese, Taiwanese regulations. What this does is it searches across the world for translations in ethanol, and it'll find everything in every country in the world. Currently, the content is translated into 112 languages, which covers everything that we're interested in. If we look here at the topics, you won't be able to read this because even I can't read them, yeah? But basically, they're all the major chemical areas. So things like dangerous chemicals, environment, import-export, inventories, workplace. So they cover all the normal things you want. In the subtopics, it's extensive, and it covers everything from registration, occupational exposure limits, health and safety, you name it, it's in there. And if you look on here, this is an example. I put the word ethanol in, just search for that. I thought, why not? And there they are. In the dangerous chemicals, there's 10,914 regulations. And you can drill down and subdivide it to get down to what you want to look at. You can also search by country. So you might only be interested in the regulations in Korea or Western Europe or Asia. And you can tick as many as you want. And then it refines the search and brings it down. And then you can keep adding and taking away subtopics and regions to refine your search and refine it to get it to where you want to be. You can also add a start and stop date. So if you only want to look for things that are current, say 2017 to present day, put them in, it will clip the search profile down. Here's an example. You can't see it at all because I can't see it, but what we've done here is we've actually done this search for ethanol, and we've looked and defined the subjects, and you see little strip outputs, and this is what you actually see on the website. Each one of those is a PDF, and it's been seeded by someone that's voluntarily given it to us and put it up onto the internet. When you click on that, you can then enter into the world of translation. So for example, this is a document that in this case, I think it's in, I'm not sure what language that's in, but it's Eastern European or something like that. I can't read it at all. What Google enabled us to do was to use their translation widget, they call it. So you can translate that, if it's Romanian document, into 112 languages by just pressing the button, and it instantly creates. It allows you then to search within that document using the search terms you had and go into the subpages, and then if you want, you can download it, save it, print it, you can have it. There's no security on this at all. If you want it, you can take it. But to be honest, if you want to collect every regulation in the world, you need to get a better life. It's boring. But what you can do is you can find the regulation you want, you can understand it in your language, and then say, I need a consultant to help me with this problem. Take it to the consultant then. There's no longer a need to pay companies in China $2,500 US to get a translation of a Chinese regulation. They're all free now. So that changes the game completely. For the planned development, because this thing will continue to grow, it'll be the future, the way you find information on regulations. We're going to extend the scope of the regulation. At the moment, it's general chemicals predominantly, but we're going to include food contact, pharma, agrochemicals, the lot. And we're working now with partners that are working in these areas to harvest the regulations from around the world and put them in, and we'll maintain them free. Secondly, I said, at the moment, we've got just under 4,000 regulations from 2016 to date, and they're being indexed, and within 6 weeks, they'll be in the system. So all of the current regulation around the world will be in there. And the future regulations, well, we're working with regulatory agencies and with consultants and experts in fields to send through new regulations as they become issued. You know, it took us nearly 5 years to develop this database at a cost of nearly €750,000, and we've given that for nothing. In the future, the regulators will provide us the regulations free, and they'll automatically be put in it. So there'll be never a case of not knowing whether you've got the latest regulation. It'll be there. And that's the end of the presentation. Enjoy it. Were there any questions, by the way? There's probably one you might be wondering, that is, why on earth did we do this? Yeah? Well, the reason we did it is because we firmly believe the chemical industry needs to defend itself better in the future. And only if you know about regulations and how to comply with them will you improve health and safety and the reputation. So it's our gift to you, the chemical industry.
Thank you, Dr. Mark, for introducing us to this free resource on regulations of chemicals in various countries across the globe. As a mark of our appreciation, we will present you the certificate of plantation